Hey, I'm Mel.
Hey, I'm Mol.
I'm Victoria.
Welcome to the Podyssey.
With the GlioBabes.
2 girls,
2 brain tumours.
And 1 GP.
What could possibly go wrong?
Let's find out.
So in today's episode, we are joined by Dr Victoria McBride. Victoria, thank you so much for agreeing to come onto the podcast. Please, can you introduce yourself, and for our listeners that don't know who you are yet, just a brief background, brief introduction into why you're now here sat on the podcast.
Thank you both very much for having me on. I really appreciate it. So yeah, I'm Victoria and I'm a GP. I'm based in Edinburgh in Scotland.
We are so excited. So thank you, because we can imagine you are very busy. We didn't think we'd be able to get a GP on. So we're very, very grateful. And I'm sure many people will be very grateful for your perspective as well. We'd love to dive straight into it. We love getting very deep, very quick. It's kind of on brand for the GlioBabe. We'd love to hear your story. What pulled you into campaigning for brain tumours? And we know you do a lot and talk a lot about earlier brain tumour diagnosis as well. Was there kind of like a single, this can't keep happening moment for you?
Yes, absolutely. There was. And this all came from personal experience for me. So if we're going to dive deep in, I'll just get started. 29th of October 2021, I received what was to date the worst phone call I've ever had in my life. I had a phone call from my brother Mark to say that his son Scott, my nephew, had been admitted into hospital with a mass in his head, which was, a brain tumour. And straight from that moment, life just completely changes. Your whole life is just upside down. The fear, the uncertainty. I just really couldn't believe that this was happening. It was almost like being put into a completely kind of parallel universe almost. It was like, what on earth are you talking about? What do you mean Scott has a brain tumour? So my nephew Scott is 26. So he was 26 at the time of his diagnosis. He had been travelling through Southeast Asia and Australia. And he came back, just before the kind of the pandemic kind of lockdown hit. And he'd been working in the bank and just kind of being the usual kind of funny, happy Scott. Certainly, I had no idea that he had any symptoms at all. So he was admitted in on the 29th of October. So it was a very scary time. We just really had no idea what was going to happen. He was stabilised for about 9 days on steroids and then underwent neurosurgery on the 8th of November 2021 and came through that surgery incredibly well. We were so lucky to have just the best neurosurgeon that could possibly have been involved in his care. And he went through 6 weeks of radiotherapy and a year of chemotherapy. He's doing really, really well. So that, I'm so grateful for that. In terms of his journey, what people need to appreciate is that we as a family only found out about Scott's diagnosis at the time that he was diagnosed. What we didn't appreciate was his journey up until that point. And that's only something that became apparent over the following weeks after his diagnosis. So for Scott, it turned out he'd actually been to the GP 8 times before his diagnosis was made. Now, I'm a GP myself and I'm not big on GP bashing, but I really feel really passionate that Scott's journey was really quite unacceptable and something that made me stop and say, right, okay, what do we need to change here? What needs to change? This cannot happen again. So for Scott, what we found out, what he told us about his journey was that he started off in December 2020 with kind of unusual sensations in his right leg. So he describes kind of tripping over something that wasn't there, thinking, oh, that's a bit odd. And contacting the GP practice and having a telephone consultation. There's still some COVID restrictions at that point, and being told, well, just wait and see, call back in 4 weeks if things are still happening. Now, I'm not saying that that's wrong at all, because, sometimes as GPs, we do see kind of odd things happen that give a bit of time, things revert back to normal, and we never really know what caused that in the first place. With Scott, 4 weeks later, he called back and said, I still have these symptoms. And he was told, well, wait a bit longer, see what happens. I think it came to about April time. He now had some odd sensations, not only in his right leg, but in his right arm as well. And he didn't have any headaches or vomiting or dizziness or any other kind of symptoms that are quite often more associated with brain tumours. But these were the symptoms that he had. at this point is where a big mistake was made, which was he was advised that he may have something called functional neurological disorder. Now, functional neurological disorder is what we call a diagnosis of exclusion. So you have to have excluded other serious causes before you tell someone that they have functional neurological disorder. So functional neurological disorder is something where, despite all investigations, we can't find a definite cause for your symptoms, but you have to have ruled out things like stroke, MS, motor neurons, brain tumours before you tell someone that they have functional neurological disorder. It was suggested to Scott that he read a website on functional neurological disorder, and what happened was he went off, he read about it, and he thought, actually, yeah, that does sound like what I've got, so I'll just stop worrying about it now. And therefore he didn't share his symptoms with us as his family, because he thought, oh, well, maybe I'm stressed. I've got lots of other stresses going on. It's the pandemic, the job that I want to be in, et cetera, et cetera. So he kind of started to make light of his symptoms himself, which, was really a big reason for his delay in his diagnosis. It wasn't until later in the summer, when things like his speech started to become affected, that he went back to the GP. And at this point, he was told, well, this is probably migraine. Here's some migraine tablets. Come back in a few weeks if things aren't any better. And at this point, his girlfriend, who's now his wife, Amanda, had said to him, actually, I'm getting quite worried about this. I think we should maybe go back to the GP. So they went back to the GP and said, I'm actually quite worried about this. I've got these symptoms that aren't really going away. And he was advised at that point, well, it's migraine, not much to worry about. And his now wife, Amanda, said, well, actually, do you think that this could be anything serious? And the answer was, no, I don't really think so. This is migraine. This is what this is. He didn't actually start getting headaches until October. And it was October the 29th that, he was admitted as an emergency with what we call raised intracranial pressure. So raised pressure in his brain due to the tumour, that all of this came to light. And it was just the most awful, awful experience. As I said earlier, I thought this was a kind of one-off. He'd been admitted, and this is the first time any of us were hearing about it. In the days after the 29th of October, this was really a lot to take in. And I was just absolutely aghast when I found out that he'd actually been to the GP several times, and really kind of just couldn't believe that he hadn't come to me with these symptoms. I was kind of thinking, how has it got to this point? But when he started telling his story and saying, actually, I did go to the GP, but they told me everything was fine, that I thought, wow, okay, right, we need to look into this further. So what we did as a family is we got a copy of his records from the GP, and there was a very clear pattern that he'd been several times, that he had been suggested to him that he had, functional neurological disorder, that he'd been told that it was migraine. And so the first step we did was write a letter to the GP practice to say, this really was not acceptable care of a 26-year-old man who hadn't been to the GP for many, many years. And we got really quite an appalling reply back, which was, for me as a GP, felt like a real smack in the face, because it was, well, you didn't ask for a referral, you didn't ask for a scan. And that just was a red rag to the bull for me, because I was just absolutely furious by this response. I was like, how dare you tell my 26-year-old nephew that he had to advocate for his own scan? This was just, to me, it just did. I was so angry. So we, as a family, wrote to the Scottish Ombudsman, and our complaint was upheld actually on several counts. So it was upheld from the fact that, they failed to notice the red flag of a young male coming to the GP on multiple occasions with evolving symptoms. That no guidance really had been followed. They mentioned the fact that he wasn't given the opportunity to see the same GP because obviously continuity was an issue. They mentioned that, he was not responsible for asking for his own scan or for his own referral. That's just ridiculous. So I kind of feel like the Ombudsman report was was helpful for us as a family. But I think as a GP, it was more helpful. I kind of thought, right, well, I need to take this and I need to speak to other GPs. I need to educate people and say, look, this is what happened. This can't happen again. Unfortunately, we hear so many stories, Joe Rockcliffe, hearing Richard tell Joe's story. It just is a knife to the heart. It's just so sad. And I'm so happy to see places like England bringing in things like Jess's Law, the kind of three visits. If there's no answer, you need a referral. And we need something similar in Scotland, absolutely. But I think that, as I said, I never ever want to bash GPs, but we really do need to do better. It's a story that I hear time and time again. There's a statistic that something like, 41 to 50% of brain tumour patients have been to the GP 5 times or more. And in Scotland, 70% of brain tumours are diagnosed in the emergency setting. One of the things that I do is I sit on the Scottish Steering Committee for the Brain Tumour Charity. And recently I had a member ask me a really important question, which was, why does earlier diagnosis matter? And, a diagnosis, essentially what they were saying is, a diagnosis is a diagnosis. Doesn't matter if it was in January or if it was in October. And actually it matters hugely. It matters a huge, it matters a huge deal, really. I've come across people through my advocacy work with the Brain Tumour Charity who, because of late diagnosis, they have ended up with, paralysis, with loss of vision, loss of hearing. They're no longer able to go back to work. The earlier the diagnosis, the hope is the less deficit that you will have from the tumour. If it can be dealt with and treated at an earlier stage, then we may not be able to change the prognosis of the brain tumour, but we will be able to change the patient journey, and that's really important to me.
Thank you for sharing all of that. You said yourself there, Victoria, you wear 2 hats. You're a GP and you're an aunt. So how do you think that personal connection for you has shaped the way you see patients and the system overall, I guess?
It's a really interesting question, that, Mel, because, I think that having been a doctor for 21 years, I do like to think of myself as a kind of a compassionate person, but it's a real wake-up call because you learn so quickly that a cancer diagnosis is completely life-changing, not just to the patient, but to the entire family. And I think that, I'm so sorry, my cat has just joined us. I do apologise. That's Matthew, my cat. Right, Matthew, you can speak later. I'm so sorry.
No, that was brilliant.
Matthew, now I've lost what I was saying. Yeah, no, I think that
Can we keep that in, by the way? Can we keep
absolutely.
that in?
I think Matthew expects to be kept in, actually. He would be very upset if you cut him out. Yeah, so sorry, apologies. I think that what it's done for me is it has made me realise that a patient is never a patient in isolation. There is a whole family. That patient is a son, a daughter, a sibling, a spouse. I'm so sorry. Matthew, there you go. Say your hellos and then off you go.
Oh, I love cats.
Okay, right. Start again. Apologies.
Round 3.
Yes. So I think for me, it's made me realise that, every patient that you see is never a person in isolation. They come with a whole, the whole family, a whole friend group. Every patient is a son, a daughter, a sibling, a spouse, a best friend. That is so important. And actually, when you see people come in, you're kind of trained as doctors to be kind of clinical and objective. But actually, when someone comes in, they don't want a whole list of, well, this is the referral guidance for this, and, this is the treatment plan for this. You want, how are you? How are things going? How is work? How are you getting to work? What are you doing at the weekends now? Scott is, 26 years old and he wants to be going out with his friends. So if you've got young patients who are going through cancer journeys, it's, what are you doing to stay in touch with your friends? How is your social life going? And just being more on a human level, I would say is one of the main changes, is that it's about kind of being able to speak to someone and say, look, I recognize that your life has been turned upside down by this. Let's talk about that. Let's not talk about, the next prescription that you're going to need in 4 weeks. Let's talk about how are things actually going. Because I think, one of the things for Scott in particular was he had a year off work whilst he was going through treatment. But when he came to the end of that year, they expected him to go back to work as if nothing had happened in the previous year. And that was completely unrealistic. You know, he needed support and he needed help and he needed a plan. And I think that, you know, it's those types of things, being able to, you know, as a doctor say, well, actually, how are you going to get to work? Are you going to manage to sit in front of a computer for 8 hours? Is the job that you're doing actually a job that you can still continue to do? And if not, who can help? What can we do to help support you in that role? So I think that's really the main thing, is that it's, whilst I've been a part of lots and lots of patients, you know, ill health journeys throughout the year, until you're actually in it yourself, you realize that everything can be a mission. You know, everything can be a battle. Work can be a battle. You know, getting places on public transport can be a battle. And it's just having an awareness of all of that is what I would say has been the biggest kind of change for me.
Thank you so much. And something that, you know, I think we've spoken about, but we haven't directly said, and all our guests have come on and said, is kind of like that whole life carries on and you're still a human. And some days, you know, I don't want to talk for other people, but I've definitely got this vibe off our guests, and some of them have said it, and I definitely relate to it. I'm like, actually, I kind of wish I wasn't a human anymore and I could just focus on this one thing, because juggling it all some days is a lot. And to get that understanding from medical professionals as well, and kind of going, you know, actually, my quality of life means a lot to me, and I'm losing a lot of these things, and they mean the world because they make me who I am as a person. So lots of people, I'm sure, will very much appreciate what you've said there, and thank you for that approach that you take. And unfortunately, it's been learnt through really difficult circumstances for you, but you know, you'd be having a really big impact doing that for some people. And I don't want to put you on the spot here, but there's going to be a burning question that not just we have, but everyone has. What are, or what do you believe are the biggest barriers when it comes to GPs actually spotting brain tumours earlier and getting that process started?
That is something that I've thought about a lot, and certainly something that I've been looking at with the Scottish Steering Committee, because it's such a huge issue. I think that, as I said, I am very keen not to GP bash, because my GP colleagues do such an amazing job, and it is absolutely impossible sometimes in the system that we're working in, because obviously there's a lot of funding issues and, you know, a huge demand. I think that first and foremost, the thing I should really make the point about is that, you know, diagnosing a brain tumour is not easy. It is something that the symptoms for brain tumours can quite often be quite vague and non-specific. So as I've mentioned about Scott didn't actually even have a headache until very shortly before his actual diagnosis. So people kind of go, headaches are a sign of brain tumour, but actually, you know, we see, as GPs, we see headaches all the time. And for the thousands upon thousands of headaches that we see, a tiny fraction of them are going to have something abnormal in their brain that we need to worry about. So that's the first barrier, is that, you know, when you think about, for example, if someone comes to the GP practice and they have lump in their breast, we know that that is cancer until proven otherwise, and we have to do an urgent referral to the breast team. People who are presenting with brain tumours, the symptoms are absolutely vast, because it depends on where in your brain you have the tumour, the effect that it's having, whether it's producing hormones, whether it is mass effect. So things can be quite vague. So it can be anything from, can be headaches, it can be, like Scott, kind of odd sensations in your arms and legs, change in personality, changes in your speech. And quite often these things can be explained by a different reason. So these symptoms can also be shared with things like stress and other kind of issues as well. So I'd say that's the first barrier. And I'm not in any way suggesting that it's wrong that people have to go to the GP maybe 2-3 times before the alarm bells start going off in the GP's head, because, as I said, it is very difficult. But I think one of the most important things is pattern. Okay. So if I take Scott as an example, he was a young male who hadn't been to the GP for years. So first and foremost, that should make the GP sit up and go, hang on a second, why is this young man coming to the GP? You know, that he's not been here for several years. You know, he's not someone who's here every week. This is something we need to pay attention to. The other thing is the evolving nature of his symptoms as well. The fact that he was coming back with new symptoms each time he presented to the GP, something was different, something had evolved, something was worse. So that is something that needs to be picked up on. And one of the barriers to that in GP can be lack of continuity. So again, it's something I hear time and time again from both my own patients, but also from people who I've connected with through various brain tumour charities, is that, you hear that I never see the same GP twice. That is due to the system. GPs would much rather have continuity of care with our patients, and there are still pockets of kind of old-fashioned GPs in the country where, you have a family doctor and that's the doctor that you see. And I'm sure that if someone who had known Scott, maybe 2-3 times, if he'd seen the same GP 2 or 3 times along the way, would have said, hang on a second, this is Scott again. Something's changing here. We need to do something about this. But I think because it was, repeated short consultations with different GPs, the alarm bells were just never going off. And that's another barrier, is time. GP practice appointments tend to be between 10 and 15 minutes. It's almost impossible to do anything in 10 to 15 minutes, never mind kind of pick up on serious illness, get to know your patient, find out about things, Mol, as you say, like quality of life. It's very, very difficult. So those are the first barriers, time, recognition of these symptoms in the first place, and lack of continuity. The other barrier is, of course, kind of a more systemic matter. So some areas of the country, GPs will have direct access to CT. Some GPs will have direct access to MRI. And other areas of the country, they don't have any direct access to imaging at all. So that would mean having to refer on to neurology in the first instance, or whatever clinic they felt was appropriate. And that adds delay. So these delays can be several weeks or even months before the patient is actually seen. On top of that, there's also delays with things like having scans reported, which can add another delay onto things. The delay can be several weeks to even months before a patient is actually seen in clinic. So as you can imagine, that with any type of cancer, these types of delays are not ideal. So that's another big barrier as well, is the fact that we don't have equal access throughout the country for various reasons. That it is quite difficult. It's not a simple case of just being able to refer someone for a CT. It doesn't actually work like that in all parts of the country.
Before we go on to the next question, could I quickly ask you, you've mentioned the Scottish Steering Committee and you've also mentioned the Brain Tumour Charity.
Yeah.
Could you, for our listeners, just very briefly link those up and explain what that is and what you do?
Sure. So the Scottish Steering Committee is under the umbrella of the Brain Tumour Charity, and we are a group of patients, carers and professionals who are looking at ways to improve diagnosis. So essentially faster, better diagnosis for people with brain tumours. And we do that in a number of ways. We meet up approximately once every 6 weeks, and we have some targets that we try to meet. So for example, most recently we've been looking at referral pathways. And for anyone who doesn't know what a referral pathway is, that's essentially the road that a GP takes to get a person to a specialist. So we look at the different roads that are available across Scotland and how we can improve them, and to get people access to care sooner. And we also look at ways to increase public awareness of the signs and symptoms of brain tumours as well.
Thank you for explaining that. And I obviously had seen bits and bobs over social media, and mainly what you share, Victoria, as well. And I think it's really important for us all to know, especially as people that are so invested and involved, and even for those professionals, if they're choosing to be involved, they are invested in it, whether they have a personal experience or not. It's really important for us to understand what is going on, because otherwise it can feel very hopeless. You never know who's listening now that may pick up on what you've said and gone like, oh my gosh, they're something that maybe didn't even know that was a thing before. Mm-hmm. So there's a positive spin on this question. However, we'd love, an honest answer from you, whatever you're willing to give us, really. When it comes to devolved nations and brain tumour, be that research, policy, care, all of that, how do you think Scotland is leading or lagging? And when it does come to brain tumours in this respect?
Wow. I think that in some respects, Scotland has really shown real leadership. And obviously I am a Scot, so I'm a proud Scot. But yeah, I mean, in January 2025, Scotland launched a dedicated brain tumour research centre of excellence, which is kind of split between professionals in Glasgow and Edinburgh. And, you know, it was funded by charities such as the Brain Tumour Research Charity and the Beatson Cancer Charity. And it's a huge step in kind of building research capacity in Scotland. The Brain Tumour Research Centre is looking in particular at treatments for glioblastoma. And that is really positive because, you know, as you guys will know, there has been very little change in the treatment of glioblastoma in the last 40 years. So to see that there's new treatments being researched is really very positive. Scotland also has the cross-party group, which is a group of patients, carers, MSPs looking at ways to highlight the unmet needs of brain tumour awareness and brain tumour treatment and diagnosis. And they are, you know, working really hard to increase awareness of the need for more research and funding in this area. However, Scotland also lags in terms of kind of certain practical aspects of care and funding. And one of the things that a recent Scottish cross-party group meeting message was that kind of bureaucracy is kind of holding Scotland back. And, you know, we have the ability to carry out things like advanced diagnostics, like, you know, genomic sequencing, etc. You know, our universities have the ability to do that, but there's no funding for that. So therefore, these things have to be kind of outsourced elsewhere. So I think that Scotland has done really well in kind of trying to increase research capacity and try to address the barriers to brain tumour awareness and funding. But I do think, Molly, that there is some positive changes in Wales as well. I'm aware that there was the first ever Welsh parliamentary reception this year in March with the Brain Tumour Charity. Is that correct? Yeah. So there is some kind of change across the UK. I specifically looked up Wales for you, Molly, because I was like, I have to
No
look
one
up
has
what happened.
ever said that to me.
So yeah, so in short, I think that Scotland is showing some positive change, but there's still a long way to go.
So you've shared there, Victoria, about your involvement with the Brain Tumour Charity. Myself and Molly are also young ambassadors for the Brain Tumour Charity, and that's how we met. But at the minute, the Brain Tumour Charity are pushing for a national brain tumour strategy. As a GP, why do you think a national brain tumour strategy matters, and why it matters so much for you know, in terms of a faster diagnosis, research, and, you know, there's so many other parts that go into the national strategy, but why do you think it matters so much?
First of all, you guys are the most amazing young ambassadors. We're also grateful for everything that you do with raising awareness, and obviously, Mol, with your Brain Cancer Justice campaign as well. You're both incredible. In terms of a national brain tumour strategy, I mean, this is so important because essentially, you know, brain tumour patients have been left behind for too long, and that's evident from the statistics. As I said earlier, unfortunately, there has been very little change in A, the treatment, but B, the survivability of brain tumours for decades now. And we've seen a big change in other cancers, which is amazing. You know, breast cancer in particular, we've seen a huge change in outcomes with that type of cancer over the years. But brain tumours just haven't seen that change. Unfortunately, only about 1% of the national spend on cancer research has been on brain tumour research. And in 2018, following the very sad loss of Dame Tessa Jowell to a brain tumour, there was the UK government pledged a big uplift of about £40 million for brain tumour research to stimulate breakthroughs. But an inquiry found 5 years on that only £15 million of that had actually got to researchers. So a national brain tumour strategy is really needed because it would set targets, it would allocate accountable funding. You know, where is this money? Where is it going? What can we see in terms of outcomes? And it would coordinate efforts across the NHS and research bodies as well. So, you know, really, I think that without, you know, kind of a champion and a strategic kind of plan to take that earmarked money and actually make sure it gets used for brain tumour research, I think that these things are very easily just going to slip to the side again. But I really feel that it's so important that there is actually a national brain tumour strategy. Another reason why a national strategy matters is because it matters to patients and their families as well. It's recognition. It's recognition that what you're going through is awful, that people care, that we're trying to do something about it. National strategy matters because it matters to patients and their families as well. You know, it says, look, there's hope, there's accountability, you're being heard, we need to change things, what you're going through is awful. And that is so important. The ability to give people hope that things can change is really one of the most important reasons for developing a national strategy.
So you said there, about the Dame Tessa Jowell and the funding and the need for a national brain tumour strategy. We've spoke to multiple people about this. We've even been down to Parliament ourselves and brought up this discussion. But I think what the Brain Tumour Charity is really trying to push is that national strategy. With the Rare Cancers Bill, it passed the reading and now it's being discussed in the House of Lords. Like that's a massive step, and to be a part of that is massive. But what is something at the minute, Victoria, that gives you hope now? Hope is something that we've heard from previous guests, is something that cannot be taken away from us. But whether it's research, policy, or people just showing up for the cause and supporting brain tumours and, activists and everything else out there, what is giving you hope right now in today's space with brain tumours?
Well, I'm going to start off by saying I completely agree with you, Mel, about, kind of the activists and advocates that are out there. There are so many people, including yourselves as young ambassadors, but the Nuttall family, Richard Rawcliffe, just so many of the other guests that you've had on who are just turning up time and time again, refusing to give up, going to Parliament, Mol, obviously your Brain Cancer Justice campaign. Those are all things that give me a lot of hope. The fact that people are not just letting it go. There are also some other kind of positive things that are coming about as well. So we are seeing more investment in research. It gives us hope as well. There's a lot of kind of new medical innovations which are in the making, which would make life as a GP more straightforward. So, for example, there is some development in what we call liquid biopsy, which is a type of blood test that can be carried out in a GP clinic. Just to explain, the purpose of that blood test wouldn't be to say, yes, you have a brain tumour, no, you don't. What it is it's a test that looks for a protein that is produced by brain tumours. And if that is detected on this test, then it tells the GP this person needs to be triaged urgently to have a scan. Those types of supportive tools would make a massive difference, and I hope would reduce that 70% of people being diagnosed in the emergency setting. There's lots of other things kind of coming out in terms of the use of AI with interpreting scans. It's not something I can speak to in any great depth, but I know that the technology is there and that it's being developed. So I think that we are going to see in the next few years some changes, and I really am hopeful that research that is going into these kind of brain tumour research centres of excellence is going to come out with new treatments for glioblastoma and other brain tumours, which will mean make such a difference to families and carers and patients throughout the whole country.
I think there's something to be said there about the communication between what's going on and the really incredible things and the activists like us, because we don't get to hear about these things unless we really dig. And Mel and I both do that. We do that on purpose, whether that's through the podcast platform and bringing people like yourselves on, obviously hearing about those barriers, but also what is happening. And, we're kind of venturing into the research side of things for people listening. Bit of a hint to something there. That's all I'm going to say. There's such a divide, there's such a gap of this us and them narrative. And personally, and this is totally my own opinion, not affiliated with anything or anyone, I think that causes even more issues when we say, like you said, about GP bashing and things like this, because we don't understand and we're not given a lot of the information and being told what's going on to fix it. Of course, people at their most vulnerable are angry. But if they had a bit more of that information, which is just facts of what is going on, then maybe things would be slightly different and everyone would benefit. I got to spend time with the future leaders from the Brain Tumour Charity, 13 incredible people from across the world. I sat next to someone that had flown from New York to be there. I was thinking, gosh, you've come all this way and you've sat by me all day, you poor thing. And it was like hearing from, thanks, Mel, hearing from them meant the world. But unless I'd heard from them and had the opportunity to be in that room, which I had to apply for, like really put myself forward, why should I be in that room? Had I not had that opportunity, I would have had no idea what was going on. And yes, you can look it up and read a bit more about their work. And we know work's happening around lay summaries and making research more understandable to the everyday public. Like, this is not my podcast and no one's asked me my takeaway, but I'm going to tell you mine anyway. My big takeaway from what you've said today, of course, is everything. But a lot of these things we've heard before in different lights, and they're a big struggle and they're going to continue to be. But something I feel we can do is bridge that gap more and more between us and them, and kind of making sure that we're all working on this together. So I think that is huge.
Thank you so much for coming on today, Victoria, and sharing it from a GP's perspective. For our listeners out there, what would be your final message and your final takeaway to them as a GP yourself?
Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. In terms of takeaway message for anyone listening, my real takeaway message would be is that if you've got any symptom that you're worried about, and it doesn't necessarily have to be brain tumours, I mean symptoms that are worrying you and are not going away and are different to your norm, and you think actually something isn't right, have an open and honest conversation with your GP about that. If you feel that things aren't being addressed, let your GP know that. It is our role to advocate for our patients. And if something is not right, if the patient is really genuinely worried that something is going on, I would say that it is upon us to try and get to the bottom of what their concern is. So whether it's a change in your bowel habit, whether it's a headache that's changing, it's not the same as your previous migraines, whether it's a lump or something that you found, go and have a chat to your GP. I know it can be difficult to see the same GP more than once, but just be open and honest about what your concerns are. And it's very difficult to send someone away who has told you that they are worried about something serious going on. So that would be my main takeaway.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Not just for that, but for everything. This episode has been insanely invaluable and needed, and we really, really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to come on, but also being as open and honest as you have been. And obviously from us and the GlioBabes community, all the best to you and your family as well. So the GlioBabes podcast, depending on where you're listening to this, if you're looking at our lovely faces on YouTube and you don't want to look at our faces, you can catch it on listening platforms, all your favorite ones now. We are everywhere, not escaping us. And if you're listening to us but you want to see our beautiful faces, then you can go over to YouTube and watch the video there. Please give us your feedback. We'd love to hear what you feel about the episodes, your best takeaways, and anything that we can do that you'd like us to cover as well on the GlioBabes podcast. You can also follow us on social media, on Instagram at the GlioBabes and TikTok at the.GlioBabes. We are also on there separately as Mel and Mol, and we are here for you anytime. There are very important support lines in the show notes. Anyway, you can find them if you're affected by anything you've heard today.
Please remember, you are not alone. Reach out and ask for support if you need it. I have a burning question. Pizza or pasta?
Oh my goodness. Now you're getting into like really difficult stuff. I can't possibly even begin to answer that question. Pizza or pasta? Oh my word. I think it's going to have to be pasta.
Yeah,
I agree. Really good spaghetti carbonara.
Yes,
definitely has to be that, or a really good quality bolognese. Yeah.
Okay.
I did not expect questions of this depth. I wasn't quite prepared for that.